105 years of commercial aviation industry really has connected the world. 4.5 billion passengers get carried on an annual basis. $7 trillion of goods get moved through the airspace. And 88 million jobs are created around the globe with this aviation ecosystem. And it's projected by 2050 that the passenger movements will be over 10 billion passengers a year. So aviation at once has become what's made the globe smaller and spurred commerce around the globe.
At Boeing, our purpose is to protect and connect and explore our world, and we do that through the design and production and servicing of aerospace products.
Boeing looks at decarbonizing aviation in 4 pillars. And that starts with the fleet renewal programs that our customers do. The next area is operational efficiency. The next is renewable energy and the renewable energy transition. That includes sustainable aviation fuels, green hydrogen, as well as renewable electricity. It's really an ecosystem that needs to evolve. Our 4th pillar, which is the new technology and the implementation and integration into a new aircraft type. So in 2050, I think the aviation sector can be at net zero.
I think the responsibility we feel at Boeing is really to help aerospace grow and grow sustainably.
It definitely is a team effort.
It's about our future generation to allow the atmosphere to have lower carbon in it while we are able to still satisfy this demand of people wanting to connect anywhere in the world.
I just have to go. I think this is working. Hello everyone, good morning. You're very welcome to the 7th Annual Aviation Summit from A4E. My name is Kevin Heine. I'm the new-ish Communications Director at A4E. Would just like to welcome you all here today. Just some housekeeping and an outline of how we're going to proceed today. For today's press conference, we'll start with presentations from the panelists before you. In front of me, we have Laurent Doncil, who is Acting Managing Director at A4E. He'll be followed by Michael O'Leary, CEO of Ryanair Group, then followed by Carsten Spohr, CEO of Lufthansa Group, and then finished up with Johan Lurgen, CEO of EasyJet. What I would just ask is, before you ask your question, if you just identify yourself and the outlet you're working for. Just a note, we are live streaming today's press conference, and to those of you who are following online, we are using Slido. So if you are following online, you could submit questions on Slido for the CEOs present today. I would also say, if you have a specific question for a specific CEO, if you can just mention that when you're asking your question. Just one piece of housekeeping to flag at the end. I know, some of you are trying to nab CEOs as they pass in and out. We have a very short turnaround between the press conference and the next panel. So I just ask if you could either do that outside or minimize the side paneling between the 2 panels. That would be really appreciated. So today, without further ado, we have an introduction from Laurent Doncil, who is Acting Managing Director at A4E. He's going to give a quick overview of the state of play at A4E. And so now I will pass to Laurent.
Thank you, Kevin. Very warm welcome to all of you, the 7th Summit of A4E. Before we let the CEOs get started, just a very quick overview about who A4E is, an introduction for those of you who are not familiar with Airlines for Europe. A4E is Europe's largest airline association. We account for nearly 3/4 of the traffic in Europe. We now represent 16 airline groups, along with 6 manufacturer members and 4 law firms. Last year, A4E Airlines carried over 610 million passengers, employed over 330,000 people, and had a fleet over 3,300 aircraft. This clearly shows a remarkable recovery for A4E members in 2022 since 2021. But you'll hear more about this from the CEOs as they make their interventions. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair Group. It's a great pleasure to be with you here again today on the occasion of this A4E event. I've been delegated to give you an update on progress on the single aviation market. As you know, the single aviation market has been one of the transformational developments in the European Union and the common market. Over the last 20, 30 years, thanks to the single market for air travel, which is at the forefront of the European agenda, is the freedom of goods, people and services to move freely across Europe. Millions of Europeans have been able to travel, work, study, live across Europe. Deregulation and competition between the airlines has dramatically lowered the cost of air travel, bringing it within the pocket of every European citizen, regardless of income. We've freed Europe from the previous regime under which you had to be one of the rich 1% to be able to fly. But the single aviation market is incomplete. We have been here now for 10 years calling for a reform of the European Airport Charges Directive, particularly in a post-COVID world where many of the biggest and richest European airports seek to recover their lost revenues from customers, the airlines, and our passengers. This is unacceptable. London Heathrow is a perfect case in point. They were shelling out dividends during COVID to their state-owned shareholders, and yet as we emerge out of COVID, they claim now an inability to be able to invest in their facilities without increasing airport fees by 50%. This is simply unacceptable, and we need action from the European Commission to deliver the much promised but sadly still undelivered reform of the European Air Charges Directive. On air passenger rights, it has now been a decade since the Commission promised a reform of EU 261. We all support passenger rights. When we do something wrong, when we cause a delay or a cancellation, a passenger is entitled to compensation. However, the vast majority of flight delays and cancellations today, tomorrow, and in recent weeks have been caused by French air traffic control strikes. We have to provide right to care. We provide compensation for those flight delays and cancellations, and yet we're not allowed to recover those costs from the people who are causing these delays and cancellations, which is the French Air Traffic Control Service, who are protected by immunity, from governmental immunity, from action. This is manifestly unfair. EU 261 is now costing Europe's passengers €5 billion on an annualized basis, and yet the scandal of ATC strikes continues. In the first 3 months of last year, In the first 3 months of last year, there was 3 days of French air traffic control strikes. In the first 3 months of this year, so far, we've had 23 and still counting. And give you an example of what happened. Over the last weekend, we had French air traffic control strikes Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Ryanair, which is Europe's largest airline, but only one airline, we were forced to cancel 230 flights over the past weekend. We cancelled the flights of 41,000 passengers because French air traffic control wouldn't allow us to overfly France. We delayed and had flight delays affecting 2,200 flights. That was 400,000 of our passengers in the last 3 days had their flights delayed because the French air traffic control unions want to go on strike. Now, we all support the right to strike. However, the French use minimum service legislation to protect the vast majority of French domestic flights. So while French air traffic control are on strike, the French are flying away happily immune to these strikes. All of the cancellations are being taken by overflights. So British people flying to Spain, Germans going to Portugal, Irish people connecting to Italy. We have our flights cancelled or significantly delayed on a daily basis because the French air traffic controllers want to go on strike. Eurocontrol wrote to the European Commission in December of last year calling for action. And it's not radical action. They suggest that we should have minimum services applied to air traffic control services across Europe. We should protect overflights during periods of national ATC strikes. And we ask the question, why has nothing been done? Commissioner Vălean will show up here for 10 minutes, give you a very brief summary of what she's done in the last 2 years, then scuttle out. But ask her why she's not taking any action on protecting overflights, on protecting the right to freedom of movement of European citizens, and protecting the single market for air travel. The European Union has done a terrific job during the Brexit negotiations of prioritising the single market and protecting the single market. Yet when a bunch of French air traffic controllers want to go on strike, hands up, do nothing. We're calling on Commissioner von der Leyen, in the absence of any action from Commissioner Vălean, to take action. We want protection of overflights. People should have, and air traffic controllers should have the right to strike, but if there's going to be flight cancellations, it should be the domestic flights in that country that take that hit. The Italians already do this, they protect overflights. The Greeks protect overflights. Why isn't the European Union doing likewise? So we're calling today, and we've set in Ryanair, and I speak here for Ryanair, we've set up a petition We want to get 1 million signatories over the next 3 months, and then we will submit that to the European Commission, asking Commissioner von der Leyen and her Commission to take some action to protect the single market for air travel, which is on a daily basis being shut and impinged by French air traffic controllers. And with that, I'll hand over for the good news to my colleague and friend Carsten Spohr, who has stepped down this week as chairman of our group. Carsten.
You never offered that to me, but we'll talk about that later. Michael's example, I think, is one more proof that our industry, as much as people like us trying to optimize our own companies' activities, are limited in some of the aspects of our industry. We need governments to support. And another example, besides air traffic control, is sustainable aviation fuels and the decarbonization of the industries. There's things we can do, other members of Airlines for Europe do, other airlines around the world can do, but there are things we cannot do. And that's obvious that in our industry, and we are speaking on behalf of the industry today, no serious player denies the commitment of the industry to support the decarbonization of mobility in general, and in our specific case, to go down to zero carbon in 2050. But this requires huge investments way beyond what we can do financially, but also way beyond what any individual company can do, because it's infrastructure issues. We cannot build airports, and we cannot build factories for sustainable aviation fuels. And even if we could, we would only do that when there is incentives, which, for example, the US has been managing to do. The US, maybe a little later than Europe, but has surely discovered the potential of sustainable aviation fuels. And what do? They create tax advantages for producers and for buyers, airlines, to get incentivized to use these fuels and to bring up not just the use, but also bring up the production volumes of this very important part of decarbonizing our industry. And that's something we are missing in Europe. We are missing in Europe any support in this regard. We rather see blending mandates forcing us to buy non-existing volumes of sustainable aviation fuel at crazy prices, 5 times as much as fossil fuels, which obviously will not allow any of us to use more of that than what hopefully more and more passengers are willing to accept in terms of higher fares to compensate the airlines for it, because at least in our case, 30% of our costs are fuel, which maybe is a little less for a short-range airline, but for a long-range airline, that's probably a pretty good average around the world. How can you accept 5 times as high prices for fuel when 30% of your cost base is this single item? So we definitely have another issue besides air traffic control, where governments, airlines, our industry, other players in the industry, think about the engine manufacturers, but also society in general, need to show commitment that we have to make the right investments to scale up availability of synthetic aviation fuels and bring down the price disadvantage of these fuels quickly. And let's be honest, there is a global race on this already about where is investment going to build up volumes. And right now, while we speak, investments go towards the US, because they have, with their policies, created attractiveness, again, for investors to produce, but also for customers and airlines to use synthetic aviation fuels. And the, obviously, Inflation Reduction Act is, among other things, also focusing on this. And I think Europe has to be very careful. We lost the race for one sustainable industry when it comes to batteries. We lost the race when it comes to the sustainable ideas of solar panels. If we now also lose the global race for synthetic fuels, we don't only reduce our potential improvement on environmental topics, we prove once again that Europe is not competing where it should be with the engineers and the scientists we have on this continent who do know what needs to be done. So further measures to bring up sustainable aviation fuels, but also other ideas of decarbonization, hydrogen, electric propulsion for smaller airplanes, not the ones we use, but there's other parts of aviation. So I think it's time that we don't only talk about this and create, mandates, additional cost, but let's focus on the scaling and incentivizing of using these measures to decarbonize our industry. And that, I think, is, again, something where what always strikes me, between the positive attitude towards aviation when it comes to the individual consumer, which of course also everybody in the city to a certain degree is, and then when it comes to policy making towards aviation, we see a huge gap. So I think our job, partly also the job for Airline for Europe, is to close that gap and turn some of the positive energy we see in our customers. This summer, we basically see more customers than we can fly almost. Let's turn that energy which exists among the voters and people in Europe towards policies which help us to stay in the race, not just for competitiveness in financial terms, but also in competitiveness for reducing the environmental impact of our industry, which totals up to 2.8%, as we all know, of carbonization around the world. And that, I think, is a very important topic, not the only one, again, which cannot be done alone, where we need politics and the industry to work together. Thank you.
Well done.
Right, thank you very much. And following on from that as well, I'm going to pick up actually points that already been raised by Michael and by Carsten. And I'll start off with this thing about the demand. And, you know, this is the good news. I mean, if you remember, it wasn't a long time ago, even, you know, where we had these forums where there were questions, and I think it came from the audience to say, look, will customers ever fly again to the same extent? Will the business that you're in actually be back to the levels that we've seen in 2019? And I think we can say already right now that, you know, adamantly what we argued all along, absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. And whether this is a pent-up demand or whether it is a new level of demand, we know now that people are putting this in terms of flying and traveling and taking their holiday, visiting friends and family, as in many cases, in many markets, as the number one thing that they want to do. We've seen that there have been changes throughout the pandemic with COVID that refers to how you want to work, mobile working, hybrid working. But one thing that is really, really clear in all the service that we do is travel and experiences comes up on top. So that's the great news. That's the great thing. And we're seeing this also in the demand. In 2022, where, if we remind ourselves, I think it was only about this time last year that we saw some of the last travel restrictions were being unwinded. In that year, we saw that there were 9.3 million flights in 2022, which is equivalent to some 83% of the capacity that we had in 2019. This year, we're looking at that 9.3 million to go up to 10.2 million, which is 92% of 2019 capacity. And it's actually, if you're looking at the loading of those numbers, I think that at the end of the summer, we're going to be back and some airlines will be over and above those levels as well that we had in 2019. And this is really great because fundamentally, you know, there was a debate not long ago whether actually is travel going to come back because of what has happened since the pandemic, and now we know that is the case. Now, one of the other questions that we also get a lot asked about and what we have focused a lot on, how can we make sure that we deliver a great experience for our customers? Safety and a great experience for the customer is really what this is all about. Now, the issue around this, and this is where I come back to Michael's point, that airlines is only one part of the aviation sector. But the fact is that since we are picking up the cost and we are consumer-facing to our customers, we are being seen as liable for everything that can go wrong in that chain. And we have a number of examples now with ATC, with air traffic controls, and then also airports, who causes us to do the delays and cancellations when the airlines are picking up the bill for that, and also the blame for consumers without having them to support and contribute into that process. And that just simply has to change. There's otherwise no incentives for them to do anything to the point that was raised before. But I think one of the things, and we discussed it at the A4E here last night and this morning, we have all gone through the suppliers to the extent we can. We have all made sure that we can do whatever we can to deliver a fantastic experience. But as we're seeing, as of today, with the cancellation that takes place, with the delays that takes place, that is simply out of our control, you know, there is a huge challenge in here that relates to more than what the airlines can do. And that's the reason why we want to bring attention to this at this forum. And we need to, and we will work with our colleagues around this to make sure we can deliver a good experience as possible for the customers, but we need to see some action when it comes to the things that Michael was mentioning when these things happen. And related to that is then also the question about the airspace reform. If we can just go to that one as well. This is a really interesting one, and it's also it's almost an exhausting one to talk about because we have talked about it for so long. And I know the question that's going to come up when we do the Q&A here, and I think I see the gentleman, I remember to say that what is going to change right now in terms of the fact that this has been debated now for over 20 years. The solution that the single European sky was going to give us is adamantly clear and is very much there. The difference is now when you look at what this can contribute to the things that is really a top priority for this industry and how to decarbonize is the enormous amount of savings on CO2 emissions if we could now finally getting this done. And this is what the decision makers have to realize. It is the quickest and the most efficient, the least expensive action we can take today to actually reduce CO2 emissions from this industry. And I've taken an example here. This is an EasyJet, an example on the route that actually not only EasyJet flies to, but it's between Paris and Milan, and we fly this frequently on an everyday. We have taken that route and we have measured what the fuel burn is on that. And if we compare that to what we could deliver with what single European sky would promise, we would save 19% of CO2 on each and every one of those flights. 19%. And this is one example that we have across the network. Now, the thing about this is that if you're then taking a look at to say, well, what is the cost of actually removing CO2 from there? What is the cost of the activities that takes place and the technologies that are there? It is by far the cheapest way on removing a CO2 ton of carbon emissions in the air. Way cheaper than ETS, not in the scale of carbon removal technologies, and SAF is just way, way out there. And I think what we need to do, and we discussed this here with A4E, we need to be able to translate what the costs are in terms of money, to actually translate what it means in CO2 savings, in carbon emission savings. Because I think that's going to be a highly uncomfortable argument for decision makers why this isn't done and why this is not being introduced as well. So we must focus on creating the delivery of this reform that has been so much out there for such a long time as well, and really do it for the sake of the planet, and really do it for the sake of also the industry to continue to thrive and to continue also to grow in the future. And I think that was my last slide.
Great. Thank you,
Unless
Johan.
it's a surprise for me.
Just before I open it up to Q&A to the audience, I should say, of course, we have 3 CEOs present. Ben Smith sends his apologies, and as you'll see later, Luis Gallego is going to only do age-appropriate sports in the future. Unfortunately, he's been unable to make it today. So with that, I'll open it out. I see Tim at the front. We'll take it one by one, and then...
Let's start with that one.
Why should you get incentives for something that you have to do, really, in order to survive?
Sorry, can I say on taxes, and I hand over to my colleague. You tell me when there is any proof that taxes has been anything good to decarbonize what we're doing. Give me one example of that. The revenue from the taxes has in very rare cases gone on to do anything what it takes in terms of decarbonization. It's been there to filling up pockets from the governments and their own deficits in there. That's what we don't like. We pay our fair share of taxes. We displayed this on the stage many times before. But I think what we're upset about, and certainly what I am upset about, is that why isn't that funds there to help us transition into something that we want to do, which is decarbonization in many aspects. And you know there are many taxes that are being called so-called green taxes, and it doesn't do anything with that.
So you'd be prepared to pay more taxes if they were actually...
Well, let's start by making sure that the taxes we're paying going on to decarbonize what we do.
But the important is, and this answers the second part of your question, or your second question, these taxes, like the German aviation tax, which of course I don't like, at least they apply to everybody who takes a passenger from Germany to anywhere else in the world. If it's Lufthansa, if it's somebody else in Europe, if it's somebody in the Gulf. Blending mandates or our participation, we as European airlines have to do in the emission trading system, only applies to European airlines. It doesn't apply to non-European airlines. You want to fly to Singapore tomorrow? You can either fly via Paris or Munich. You have to pay emission trading for your flight from Brussels to Paris, or in that case, sorry, Brussels to Munich. If you want to go via Doha, you don't need to pay emission trading. You also don't need to be part of blending that airline which might take you to Doha. It just doesn't use synthetic fuels. So carbon leakage at its best, the environment surely has no advantage, but the European airline industry has to live with the fact that it's cheaper to bypass environmental reduction ideas if you hub outside of Europe. So where's the environment upside on this? It's carbon leakage at its best, which in other industries, let's be honest, the European Commission has addressed as an issue. Why don't they address it also for our industry? Yeah, and on top of that, I can only support Johan's arguments on taxes.
Yeah, and I would make the point on, last year we paid 650 million in environmental taxes. Governments have levied environmental taxes on our airline and on our passengers. When Gordon Brown introduced APD 20 years ago, it was going to be ring-fenced for environmental measures. Now all of that money is being trousered. None of it is being spent on environmental measures. And the point we as an industry make is, the market will not supply SAFs. And where the market doesn't supply SAFs in either any meaningful volume or at meaningful price, there has to be government intervention. And we ask the question, where is all this money, the billions of environmental tax that Europe's airlines are paying on an annualized basis? What are governments doing? Frittering it away. It's not. They are specifically designed by government to be environmental taxes. We as an industry accept that we and our passengers must pay those environmental taxes, but we rightfully ask the question, what the hell have you done with the environmental taxes, and why are they not being used, as Carsten has rightly said, to at least subsidize or to incentivize the rapid acceleration of the production of SAFs? Because there isn't any other way of getting to net zero by 2050 unless the European governments take that environmental income that they are taking from us and our passengers and use it to massively accelerate the production and supply of SAFs, so that we can all benefit from
I know it's a press conference. Sorry, I know it's a press conference where you are supposed to ask questions, but let's do a little quiz. You may follow. There was some issues, especially between Germany and the EU, on e-fuels last week. Maybe some of you followed that. How much percent you think of all the SAF we right now use is e-fuel? 0. There are no e-fuels available yet beyond academic research, some of them funded by us. I'm sure my two competitors are funding something as well. The only scalable SAF form is e-fuels, because biofuels cannot be scaled to beyond a certain degree. So where do we think all this comes from? And this is where, obviously, an airline has its limits. But I know you want to ask the question, so
okay, I'll take a few more. I think Sid from Bloomberg, and then I'll come back to you, Joanna. I'll come back to you, Joanna. So if we go for Sid from Bloomberg.
Yeah.
We have to answer quicker, huh?
Two questions. One was on summer 23. You talked about the airlines being prepared, but the rest of the industry needs to be prepared. So where are you in discussions with your airport partners and suppliers in terms of preparedness, and will we see chaos? We've already seen flight cancellations, we've already seen strikes, we've already seen sort of walkouts, UK Passport Office on strike. So is summer 23 going to be worse than 22, or was it going to be better, or is it going to be the same? And second, on SAF, I mean, we've seen sort of SAF incentive to suppliers to make more SAF. does the airline industry want specific measures for themselves, or what exactly are you asking for in terms of incentives?
So maybe Johan, if you want to take.
Can I take summer 23? I think summer 23 will be materially better. The airports, security, the airlines, the handling agents are much better staffed and prepped for the summer. However, that doesn't mean that the summer isn't going to be very difficult. Air traffic control strikes are going to be infinitely worse. There's capacity restrictions on European ATC systems because of the military activity over Ukraine, and the overflights over Russia. All of the Asian traffic is being funneled down across German and southern Eastern European airspace. So air traffic control is going to be materially worse. And as I said already, we've had 23 strikes from the French in the first 3 months of this year compared to just 3 last year. So I think the airports and the handling will be significantly better. Air traffic control will be significantly worse. And SAF, I don't know whether you want to take Johan or Carsten?
Well, again, we can look at the US. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are tax incentives, both for producers of SAF and for those who buy them, like airlines. I think this could be thought of. I think there could be even an incentive scheme beyond airlines where we just incentivize the oil industry and energy industry to even produce them. I think it's also a question, is it interesting for them to produce SAF versus producing fossil fuels? Right now, obviously, if you look at their margins, they're doing quite well without SAF, and that maybe is not the way to the future. And just to reiterate, all the SAF in the world we assumed would go to us would last 5 days. Let's say take Lufthansa needs 20% of all the fuels in aviation in Europe, so for all of us, one day, all the SAF in the world would be gone if the European aviation industry would have access to everything produced right now in the world, all bio-based. So this is something where only significant investments of the political partners we have can change this issue, which is the issue of the next years. It's not something for 2060, 70, 80. It's something where we want to see results in this decade. We want to go down to 50% CO2 by 2030, and SAF is a big part of it. Another big part is buying new airplanes, which the three of us do, but let's be honest, if you order an airplane now, you cannot even get it this decade. So we already know how many airplanes will be flying in Europe in this decade with newest technology among us and, of course, our competitors not present here today. So there's limits to what this part and pillar can do.
I think we have a question in from Simon Calder, who's watching online from The Independent in the UK via Slido. He's asking, what are the panel's views on the trajectory of short and long haul fares over the next few months and years? So basically, where are fares going to go over the next few months? Short and long haul fares, are they going to go up or down?
Fares the next few months.
Oh gosh, listen, doing a trading statement, are we? There we go. I mean, look, clearly there is a great sense of good demand that is out there, and I think we all have reflected that in the trading statements that we have been doing. But as always, it's going to be very competitive. I mean, you have certain routes that are more competitive than others. But even as we speak of today, with the statements that we have left in the past, we have about 50% of all our program that is now on sale that sells for under £50, as an example. So you're always going to be able to find very, very attractive fares. But at the same time, we also see that there is a strong demand that is out there. So I think it will be like, same but different. A lot of competitiveness out there on certain routes. You can always find great deals, but it's also, clearly a good demand that we're benefiting from.
No, I think long range I think there's a global element of strong demand and limited supply. And there's different reasons. In Germany, well, I think in Europe, Michael rightly saying, staff shortages on the ground, air traffic control shortages. In the US, pilot shortages. Globally, engines and engine parts are missing in airplanes as well. So overall, I think we see what Johan was describing for Europe. But most long-range traffic, we all know, is not point-to-point. It's via a hub, which by nature creates competition because there's always another hub you could use as well. So I think the competitive element is well in place. And put that together with a healthy demand and supply curve, I think we are seeing, yields in the vicinity of what we saw before last year when a similar situation has arisen.
Okay, next question.
Kathy, did you have a question? Yeah, I'm going to go on this side of the room and then I'll come back.
We need to speed up. We have 15 minutes, so Kathy, shout.
Yeah, Carsten, you also mentioned, you would like to see other measures to support the uptake of different technologies, not just SAF. Like you mentioned, hybrid electric, hydrogen. What exactly, which measures would you like for the uptake of these new technologies?
Yeah, I think as an engineer, as a pilot, I love the idea of hydrogen. I love the idea of small electrical airplanes. But let's be honest, the easiest and by far most usual leverage comes from single European skies. It doesn't take high tech, it just takes political will. The second biggest leverage is from new airplanes, or the newest airplanes, which are existing, mainly the engine technology. Whenever we take a new airplane in and take an old airplane out, 20, 25, 30%, depending on the model. So again, hydrogen is wonderful. There are smart people working on that. For smaller airplanes, electrical one day for, whatever you call it, island hopping, general aviation might exist, not for our industry, at least I think. But let's take the most useful and the biggest lever first.
And also just to mention, I mean, as we have set out, when you're doing a net zero roadmap 2050, you're going to need a lot of technologies.
Yeah.
You're just not going to bet on one thing that is in there. And by the way, we don't know exactly how electric, how hydrogen will plan out. We don't know exactly the efficiency and the cost of the synthetic fuels when they're available. But what we do know is that there's a huge amount of research that goes into these things. Many, many hundreds of projects in this that are quite promising. And remember that, the developments when it comes to these technology, it's not linear, it's exponential. It's tremendous, a lot of things happening in there. But to Carsten's point as well, we are here right now where we need to take action now. So, to continue to invest for the future, but doing something about this today is the most critical thing that we can do. And that's why the airspace reform is so important.
Lady here, Victoria? I'll give it to Victoria first. So.
Just speak, it's not a big room.
Yeah.
Good morning, Victoria Moores with Air Transport World. I'm wondering if there's scope to change the conversation a bit. And by that I mean there's all this talk about taxation, government subsidising, escalation of SAFs, etc. Is there any potential for the aviation industry to come together to create a fund for yourselves to then support this R&D, or would that hit anti-competitive clauses?
I think R&D, we're all doing a lot ourselves, supporting universities, supporting startups, at least we do, and again, I'm sure my competitors do similar things. But the volumes here are huge. And it's not only we are missing incentives, I mean, that's not the slogan of the day. We are currently penalized for doing carbon reduction activities by participating in the emission trading system as a European carrier, where you don't need to participate if you have a hub outside of Europe. So we're not even talking about supporting, we are this time just asking for a level playing field, which currently works against us. But I think it's not the R&D issue, there's more. It's huge investments required. This fuel will not be produced in Europe, because you need enormous amount of clean electrical energy, which we're not going to have in Europe. We're either going to have it in Latin America, Africa, other parts of the world. So this is something way beyond every airline can do on its own.
I think we have a question over there from Times.
Well, I mean, I think the UK gives you a very good example of the way forward. They've halved domestic APD, and there's been a surge of new domestic routes have been opened up in this summer schedule. We opened a 2-aircraft base in Belfast yesterday. I think EasyJet have added some domestic routes. Reducing APD will result in dramatic growth in the UK marketplace, and the UK marketplace needs growth, having made such a balls of Brexit. They need as much all of the incentives you can get. But and I think there is. The purpose of A4E here in today is not necessarily to argue we just want all these environmental taxes taken away. We accept as an industry that our passengers will have to pay a fair share of towards their environmental footprint. What we're pissed off about is that money is not being used by governments who advocate using SAFs, who advocate getting to ambitious targets by 2030, 2050. They're not using the environmental taxation to stimulate the production of or the delivery of SAFs. We've seen no action from the European Commission on reform of air traffic control, which would eliminate 90% of flight delays across Europe. Think of the environmental savings that we made from that. You know, none of this is, but there is very little delivery going on today. We're going to hear from Commissioner Valian later on. You know, and I don't want to be distracted by new technology and all the rest of it. Ask the simple questions. What have you done on environmental taxation or on the production of SAFs? What are you doing about reforming the air traffic control around Europe, which is a mess? And when you got simple recommendations from Eurocontrol 4 months ago, what are you and the rest of your Commission doing to introduce those? If we allow the French, and the French are entirely free to use minimum service legislation to protect domestic flights, what's the Commission doing to protect overflights, to keep the single market or to protect the single market for flights across Europe?
I think we
And
have a
also,
question in the front
Ben,
here.
can I just say to that point as well? I mean, look, and I know you don't mind me saying this, you know, 50% of all the carbon emissions are delivered by about 6-7% of the flying that are long-haul flying. So whenever I have these discussions with people who want to restrict short-haul flying, I say, show me the benefit. What are you asking apart from restricting people's mobility of freedom? Because here's the thing, we know that if you're coming on to a train equivalent of a journey that is basically longer than 3 hours, 3.5 hours, they'll fly. So that is what the demand is out there. And then one can argue and say, well, that means that the train network isn't expanded to the way it should. Well, if you're putting in those infrastructure projects right now, you're going to take the carbon hit because it costs a lot of it. And by the time they are going to be finished, you're going to have a lot of other technologies that's going to decarbonize aviation.
I think we have a question in the front there.
Good morning, this is Andreas Scholz, freelance from Hamburg. Concerns political willingness of EU TIC 261. Do you see a real process to change for that within the EU? And second, as far as airports are concerned, they lean back and you have to pay the bill. So Amsterdam recently at least showed a little signal to compensate a certain share of their mess they created. Is there a further move like at Heathrow also to compensate for the problems at the airports?
We don't have delays. You take it, Michael.
Is there any evidence of EU 261 reform? No, there isn't. The Commission have been talking about it for 10 years. Nothing has been delivered. Meanwhile, the European courts keep extending, wrongly in my view, EU 261 into areas where they don't belong, like mechanical failures. But the fundamental weakness of EU 261 is exposed by these air traffic control strikes. We are told under the legislation that we can recover our EU 261 costs from the people who caused the strikes, but French legislation, it gives the air traffic controllers immunity from prosecution. So the airlines, one, get the blame, and I feel considerable sympathy for our passenger in Germany or in Spain, don't understand why their flight is cancelled because a bunch of French air traffic controllers are on strike. They're not flying to France, they're going from Spain to Italy. And you have to explain to them, yeah, sorry, but the sky over France has been shut down. The Commission sitting on its hands as usual, doing nothing except talking. And it is a very, so the airlines get the blame for the delays or the cancellations. We have to provide the right to care, and yet we have no way of recovering that from anybody other than our passengers. So we see no evidence of any EU 261 reform. Do we think airports are going down the right track? No. Airports trying to restrict flights is another way of airports artificially trying to boost their income. They'll restrict the flights in Heathrow this summer, then they'll say, oh, we weren't able to recover our regulated asset base because our traffic fell, and that means we have to get an increase in our charges next year under the bullshit regulatory regime they operate under. The airlines don't operate under a regulatory regime. Carsten, Johan spend billions on aircraft, and yet we don't get to go to some regulator, oh, this is a very risky investment, please let me put up my airfares by 50% for the next 5 years, otherwise I won't buy these aircraft. And yet you have a bunch of Middle Eastern shareholders in Canadian pension funds in Heathrow get to go to some Dumbo regulator in the CAA who hasn't, if his IQ was 1 point less, he'd be a plant, and say, we have to have a 50% increase in our airport fees because, oh shit, we had no business for the last 2 years, so we get to recover all that. And we're capping our traffic this year. That means we'll under-recover this year. And because we under-recovered this year, you have to reward us next year with even higher airport charges next year. You can always tell an airport when it's telling lies. Its lips are moving. And when Heathrow and Schiphol and these other rapacious monopolists want to increase charges, they should be told to rev up and foxtrot Oscar. The European Commission should push ahead with the reform of the Airport Charges Directive, and these guys should be exposed to true competition, which is what we have between the airlines, which is why our customers benefit so much from the vigorous competition between the airlines. There is no equivalent between the airports. But don't get me started on airport reform.
So time is against us. Can I have 2 quick questions in succession? I've got Andrew there and Tanguy there on the right.
Hello, this is Iteke de Jong speaking from the Netherlands. Mr. Spoor, our government wants to lower the cap of the movements of Schiphol, our national airport. Are you already partying in Frankfurt because you get more customers?
Well, Frankfurt is limiting capacity as well because shortage of staff. But more surprising for me, I grew up near the Dutch border in Germany, and I always looked at the Netherlands as being a trading country, yeah? Creating wealth from trade, initially with ships, then with airplanes. How such a trading nation can limit mobility, I have not understood yet. But my party mood is limited when I look at the capacity constraints we have at our largest airport in Frankfurt. So,
just one final question from Tanguy there, I think.
Hi, good morning. Tanguy Kemener with AFP. I'm based in Paris. I was wondering, Mr. Spoor and Mr. Lundgren, what the consequences of the current French ATC strikes were on your operations?
Well, similar than Michael's, because we are all affected. Maybe the percentage is a little lower in my case of flights crossing French airspace than it is for Michael and probably also for Johan due to their markets they are present. But I'm missing all the connections from people who want to hub in our hubs. We're reducing the local O&D traffic, so it's similar. Maybe the percentage impact is a little smaller, but I can underline everything Michael said about this.
No, I think we're very badly hit, given we got 50% of our operations in the UK, and we fly a lot over that airspace. And it's exactly the point that Michael just made. It's impossible sometimes for people to comprehend when they go in from point A to point B, and there's something happening at point C that makes the flight cancelled. And I must say that it's difficult to see also, when it's going to end.
But it's not. I mean, we got a note last night from French ATC asking us to cancel 60 flights tomorrow, less than 48 hours notice. And then also the wonderful news that the daily French ATC strikes will continue for the month of April.
Yeah.
Daily. I mean, we are all collectively facing daily cancellations of flights that aren't even operating to and from France, while the French protect their domestic flights.
And the issue is also not only actually the actual flight that happens, but because it also then affects and has a ripple effect across the whole of the network, that makes it even more impossible for somebody to understand why there's a delay on this whole thing. 20%
of the airspace is closed because of what Michael referred to with the Ukrainian terrible war going on. We have the biggest NATO maneuver coming in June, I think we have seen since the Cold War, which will have significant impact on another percentage of airspace closure. So this will be the biggest trigger that summer of 23 delays. I fully agree with
One final question. This man has been very patient all morning, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Hi, Eric Renet from newspaper Le Soir in Belgium. You are asking the same question to Europe for years about single European sky compensation, taxes and so on. How long are you still going on politely?
I think we have to keep going until we get change. I mean, ultimately, we have to keep raising these issues. We have to keep exposing the fact that this Commission has delivered nothing, and ask again next year when they deliver. Now, eventually, you'll embarrass them into actually taking some action. I mean, I think there's a significant prospect here because air traffic control is going to be so bad for the next number of weeks and months. We might finally prod Ursula von der Leyen Sphinx-like into doing something. I know she doesn't like doing anything, but that she might actually do something to protect the single sky over Europe. That is her job. But this Commission, postpones action. They talk about 2050 and 2030, and not about the 29th of March or the 30th of March. So from my point of view, we're going to keep using A4E. It's a great forum. It allows us to come here once, twice a year. And here's the checklist. Here's the report card on what the Commission has done. Nothing, 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 nothing. And you ask the questions.
Okay. But also, I do think that there is an, I don't know if you want to use that word, but there is an opportunity now because of the right focus that we all have to decarbonize. And as we talked about today and we demonstrated as well, it is the quickest, the least expensive way to get CO2 savings. This is one of the best things that anybody can do in order to decarbonize what we're doing. That focus wasn't there not long ago. That is here right now. So we need to make sure that we almost translate what the airspace reform will do in terms of the savings on CO2 emissions. Because if you have that available and you look at that, because we discussed this morning, you know, there's a difficulty around that because it can easily become quite technical about how do you move the corridors, how do you change the descents and the approaches, and how does it work, and what will it actually do, and where do we fly, and what altitude, and can we have unrestricted way of getting up in the air? That's when you lose a lot of people. Instead of saying, look, it's 19% wasted CO2 emissions on the route that people fly daily on because of your inability to take a decision on this, on a proposal that's been out there for 20 years. And when it comes to sometimes the argument, oh, it's a sovereignty about the airspace and it's for military reasons we can't do it because we need to have that space there. As a military high commander said to me the other week, look, we'll take the airspace when we need it.
Regardless.
Regardless. So we don't need to have a plan to do it. We just take it and you get a note and you can't fly. There's no excuse from the military point of view that we can't have an efficient airspace in today's Europe.
Okay, I think we'll draw to a close. We're way over time. Thank you very much, everyone. If there are any follow-up questions, you can follow up with us afterwards. We'll reconvene at 11:30 in here for the first session. Thank you.
Great, well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.